This past Tuesday evening, I suffered a bit of whiplash. Now, it wasn't that I hit a deer while driving or anything like that. Actually, I suffered the whiplash when I read the scriptures that we were going to hear this weekend, and thinking in light of those scriptures and what we experience in the regular news from day to day in this time. So just think about it. Love your neighbor, take care of the widow, the orphan, the alien. Become a model for other believers. Those are the things that we heard in today's scripture readings. Now think of what else you hear during the rest of the week, that most of the people in Puerto Rico still don't have electricity. It's been 5 weeks since the hurricane. Most of those children, now some of you might like this, kids, they're still not back in school after 5 weeks because there's no electricity. And then there was the California fires, the earthquake in Mexico, the gun massacre in Las Vegas, and since that one, there's been 2 or 3 others, not nearly as bad, but others in our country. Add to that, many people not quite knowing where to place their bets or their odds in terms of health care these days, and that's coming up. There's tax reform, there's rights and civil rights for many people, including immigrants. And so reading the scriptures in light of all that other stuff, should give us whiplash. If it doesn't, it means that we're probably not paying attention to what's going on in the world, or we're not taking seriously enough the challenge of God's holy word, because they sort of go like this, it seems, these days. There's no doubt, I think, that the world caters to the rich and the powerful. That's just a fact of life, I think. It's probably always been that way. And that many rich and powerful get that way at the expense of other people, such as widows, orphans, and aliens. Some rich and powerful even take advantage of those recovering from natural disasters. And maybe you've been in a place of a natural disaster. Maybe a strong wind came and blew the roof of your house away. And so once that happens to a community, I remember being in the Parkersburg area when that happened. And, there's just all kinds of people rushing into town saying, we can put your roof on. Well, 50% of them are scammers. And so if you're not careful, in a time of great need, you can be taken in by people who like to profit from your misfortune. To be honest and fair, however, there are rich and powerful people who do a lot to help widows and orphans and aliens. You and I would have a much different life if it wasn't for the great charity and the great kindness of some of the rich and the powerful. But too often they seem to be fewer than those who don't pay attention to the ones who have nothing. So today's gospel is pretty familiar. Once we saw it and got into it, you knew exactly what it was, the 2 great commandments. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and love your neighbor. And when you do those 2 things, you will, it says, be doing all the other things that are necessary. It says in those 2 general commandments are all the prophets and all the other religious rules. So loving God and loving neighbor would take care of it. And it's very interesting that that gospel is directly and very clearly paired with this morning's first reading. The first reading we heard was chosen to match the gospel. So how do you love God and how do you love your neighbor? Well, it said, you shall not molest or oppress an alien, for you were once one yourself at some point. Do not wrong any widow or orphan. If you lend money to someone poor, and in need, do so without expecting any interest in return. Do not extort or take advantage of them. If you ask something of your neighbor, maybe as like collateral, give it back to them as soon as possible, especially if you happen to take their coat as collateral. They may need it that very same night to stay warm, so don't hang on to the collateral. Be compassionate, then it says. Be like God. Those are very simple things, but that wonderful first reading out of Exodus is how you be loving God and loving your neighbor. It's pretty simple, but it's also kind of demanding. And I think to start to break this open a bit, it's important for us to take a look at what was a widow, an orphan, and an alien in the days in which these scriptures were written? Why did the writer pick out those three groups of people? And the reason is because those three, widows, orphans, and aliens, have at least one thing in common, is that they all, in that culture, depended on a man, a male person, to take care of them in time of danger. Women and children were totally dependent on the male figure of their household. So should a husband die, or leave, or become disabled, or whatever, and is no longer in the picture, the only thing left for the woman to do was beg. A woman in those days had no rights other than what she got from this male person. The same was for children. Should the father run away, should the father die, or whatever the case might be, the children had no, unless there was a brother or an uncle or somebody like that to step in, they too had no rights of their own. It all depended on the male figure. So there was nothing left for the children to do. They were orphaned, and they had to begin to beg. The alien, kind of similar. The alien was somebody who came from another country, another place, and they didn't have any family where they were. So they had no one to connect with, no one to look after them. And so they were literally unattached where they were physically. And they were then quite dependent. And oftentimes they too would have to beg. That's why those three in particular are picked out in the reading from Exodus. So maybe it's good for us to say, okay, so who are the aliens, who are the widows, and who are the orphans today? It's not just a woman whose husband dies. It's not just a child whose parents are out of the picture. It's a little more. So I'm going to start with the children. Why don't you, if you're going to go off to school tomorrow, raise your hand. Who's going to school tomorrow? There's a lot of you sitting here that are going off to school tomorrow. Whether you like it or not, you're going to school tomorrow. So let's take a little lesson for you kids, you students. I want you tomorrow in the cafeteria or on the playground outside or on the bus even, if you ride the bus to school, take a look at who's sitting there alone in the cafeteria. Look around the playground, look on the bus, and see who's walking around the edges of the playground, hanging around the fence or just outside. They probably shouldn't be there, but they're there. That's what they do. They hang outside because they don't feel they belong. So maybe it's Jenny, maybe it's Ryan. And then ask yourself, do they always sit alone? Is that what happens to that kid? If I want to find Jenny, do I look right by the gate of the playground along the fence, and there she goes, walking down the fence all by herself, kicking a few pieces of grass on a little stone, because nobody's paying any attention to her. Or Ryan's sitting over there in the back of the cafeteria, and he sat there yesterday, and he sat there the day before. That's just where he is. And everybody lets him there. That's the orphan. That's the widow. That's the alien for you kids. And there are some of you who know kids who probably don't even go to school. Nobody pays enough attention to even enroll them in school. They never go. So you never ever see them. But they should be there. It would be good if they were there. But even as kids, young kids, they're on their own. Some kids raise themselves. And who are they? Do you know their names? Could you know their names? Could you find out why? Ryan always is around the edges of the playground. Could you find out why Jenny always eats at a table alone? That's the lesson, I think, for you. And that it isn't, just nice to do that. It's necessary for you to do that. It's loving God and loving your neighbor. And if you want to go to heaven, that's how you get there, by paying attention to the widow, the alien, and the orphan. So, that's what you do when you go to school tomorrow. Doesn't make any difference what school you go to. I'll bet you there's one or two in every school. And there's probably one or two kids that probably should be there, but they're not. And who knows why? But maybe we could learn a little. All right, for now, us adults. When you watch the news this week, and you either see or you hear of something, or it's made known to you, and the second thought is, after you hear of the incident, you say, I'm sure glad that's not me. Because we do that. We all became concerned about the people in the fires in California. And the second thought might be, boy, I'm sure glad that's not me. Wouldn't that be awful? Somebody bang on your door in the middle of the night and say, you have 10 seconds to get out of here. Go. Grab your children. Nothing else. Or if you were living in Puerto Rico, and our second thought is, I'm sure glad that isn't me. Even somebody who gets a medical diagnosis, that's pretty tough. And we know that happens today. And we feel badly about these people that we know or even don't know. We just hear about it. We see about it. And our second